Hi, I'm John Feldt. Welcome to the Weekly Water Outlook. Been pretty busy looking at the Northeast U.S. with Sandy. And first off, if you would like to get our briefings for Sandy, go ahead and go to bluewateroutlook.com, and you can either listen to the current briefing or I'll sign up for notices for future briefings. So let's take a look at what occurred across the nation last week. For the most part, it was yet another quiet week. There was some significant rainfall over the Pacific Northwest. You can see a couple pockets of red there. That's 5 inches along the immediate coast. That feed of Pacific moisture that started a couple weeks ago or so is still feeding into the Pacific Northwest coastal sections. And many parts of that, western parts of Washington State and Oregon received at least a couple inches of rain, and like I said, a few spots a little bit higher. Over the Great Lakes, there was also a couple pockets of 2 or 3 inches of rain. Other than that, it was pretty quiet. The rainfall along the coastal parts of North Carolina and Virginia, as well as central Florida, east central Florida, are due to the initial outer bands associated with Sandy. Percent of normal rainfall, we see a lot of red sort of dividing between the south and the east being very dry, and then the northern half of the nation above normal precipitation, or at least a mixture of above normal. Now keep in mind, blue and purple is above normal, red is below normal, and that deep red is well below normal, up to 5% of normal, so 5% or less. So extremely dry over the southern and southwest U.S. as well as the southeast U.S., mid-Atlantic, and the northeast. Now it's important to note, if you look at the northeast here, pretty interesting to show that it's been very dry last week, and that's important because as we get rain moving into that area with Sandy, that'll help mitigate a bit the potential for main stem river flooding. Parts of New York State, it's a bit wetter, and we might get a higher response in that region. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Sandy because I do have that covered in another briefing, but I just want to give an overview for those of you not in that area, the track of Sandy over the week, because that's going to be the primary story regarding water resources across the nation. Here's the amounts of rainfall expected with Sandy, and anywhere from Virginia, West Virginia, up north and northeast, there will be a heavy rain event, and West Virginia, that'll be a heavy snow event. Here's the U.S. Drought Monitor across the nation, updated this week. Not a whole lot of change. I've mentioned a number of times now that as we get into fall and early winter eventually, you will see minor changes on the downward side. Now, if we get a heavy rain, we can improve quicker, but as far as getting worse, it's not going to change a whole lot, just very small changes. And we did see some expansion of the drought, some deepening of the drought, but again, it was very modest due to the lack of evapotranspiration this time of year. Now, the big picture across the nation right now, what we see here is the jet stream. We've had a trough of low pressure over the eastern U.S. This has been in effect for about 2 or 3 weeks. I've been talking about that area of low pressure for at least a month now, probably. And that is beginning to move out towards the northeast. It's picking up Hurricane Sandy as it moves up towards the northeast. That'll be early this week. And then the yellow line is late this week, and that's a motion from west to east. Not a real distinguished motion of the jet stream or positioning or intensity. And in fact, I looked at the anomalies of the jet stream pressure, and what that is saying is what areas of the pressure would be either extremely high or low, and they're very close to zero. So that's saying we have a pretty normal pattern setting up starting late this week. So in summary, starting off with this pattern we've seen for a long time, low pressure, that trough will lift out, and then we'll go back to a normal, mainly west to east position. Now, more and more you're going to be hearing me talk about the Arctic Oscillation, and I'm going to be mentioning that a bit in my newsletter coming out this week. But what I want to show here is we've been in a negative AO since most of October. This is the line here is positive above this line, and it's negative below this line. And what we have here is for most of the month it's been negative, and that's most likely the reason why that trough has been anchored over the eastern U.S. Now, I do want to mention that as we get into November more, you see it begin to go into positive range. And that's pretty typical for the Arctic Oscillation for 2 or 3 weeks to stay in one phase, a negative phase, and then as we get into another period, it might go positive after it's been in negative. So we would expect the jet stream to shift and different precipitation trends to develop once we get into this different phase or a positive phase. One of the reasons that trough has been so persistent for 2 or 3 weeks is not only the duration of this AO, but also the intensity is pretty strong. And you can see here in the middle of the month, it's very strong, and that's no doubt the reason we've had that persistent trough. Indirectly, this is probably going to enhance the impacts in a negative respect with Sandy, because that trough is going to be pulling it into it and absorbing Sandy eventually. If we didn't have such a deep trough, we could have had a different outcome over the northeast U.S. Okay, so some precipitation models this week. It's almost feast or famine. Areas are going to get heavy rain. Everybody else pretty much is not going to get impressive rain or no rain. But the same old story in the Pacific Northwest. We're having that jet stream feeding into that region. Climatologically, that's not unusual for this time of year. We could receive another 1 to 3 inches of rain over the Pacific Northwest, and then over the mid-Atlantic up towards the northeast, the rainfall associated with Sandy. Everywhere else, pretty light amount of rain, and look at all the areas with no rain. That's that area in white. No rain whatsoever over broad parts of the southwest and the southeast U.S. In fact, if we look at precipitation over the next 2 weeks as we get into the middle of November, what we see here is very dry and fairly tranquil type patterns over the nation. What we see in the first image on the top is the first week, and then the one on the bottom is week 2, and for the next 2 weeks, we very well could have very little rain over broad parts of the nation, especially over the west and southwest, parts of the Midwest, and even the southeast U.S. We'll have to see in week 2 if some of that additional rain develops over the Ohio Valley. Week 2 models often flip-flop one way or the other, so I wouldn't get too concerned with that at this time, but I think the trend is definitely towards quiet. So if we look at trends and threats, I do have a threat this week, obviously, with Sandy in red there. That will be the heaviest rain. We will also have into West Virginia, we will have an area of heavy snow that would extend south into West Virginia as well. And then up towards the northeast, what we have is some heavy rain associated with Sandy as well early in the week. Pacific Northwest, a trend of heavier rain, 1 to 3 inches. Everywhere else, the trends tend to be light rain or no rain. I have 2 trends for dry weather in the southwest U.S. and also the southeast U.S. Pretty much elsewhere, lighter amounts of rain, nothing all that exciting one way or the other. Okay, so the takeaway from this week's briefing, either too much or not enough looks like the story this week. The big story will be Sandy. Secondary story, perhaps a number of inches of rain over the Pacific Northwest. Elsewhere, just not enough rain once again. The Arctic oscillation effect will be diminishing as we get into November. And other than Sandy, quiet weather this week and most likely next week as well. Thank you for listening to this week's Water Resource Outlook. If you find this information useful, please pass it along to others. They can subscribe at bluewateroutlook.com. Thank you.